Welcome to JLive. I'm Laura Mandel, JArt's Executive Director, and it's great to be with you for JLive, our virtual series of bite-sized conversations about Jewish life and art with the best artists with Boston connections. Today, I feel very lucky to be with poet Lloyd Schwartz. Welcome, Lloyd.
Hi, Laura. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really, I'm thrilled to be here.
We're delighted. So in addition to being a total mensch, of course, Lloyd is City of Somerville Poet Laureate, Professor Emeritus at UMass Boston, classical music editor of the Boston Phoenix before it closed, of course, senior music editor at the New York Arts and the Berkshire Review for the Arts, a regular commentator for NPR's Fresh Air. And as if that's not enough, he also grew up speaking Yiddish. So this is going to be a great conversation. If you have questions while we're speaking, as always, please put them in the chat and we will answer as many of them as time allows at the end. So, Lloyd, I know that a lot of people watching are already fans of yours. So I'm excited that today we have an opportunity to talk about something that is the most personal and core to who you are, which is your family, your mother, your Orthodox Jewish upbringing that's had such an impact on you. So you actually told me that you think your best poems are about your mother. And I love that you told me she was one of the first women in Brooklyn to drive, because I think that is so telling. So let's start here with the reading of a poem that is all about your mother called The Two Horses, a poem written in your mother's voice as a child in Russia.
Thank you. The Two Horses, a memory. And this is my mother speaking throughout the entire poem. The Two Horses. You said you had lunch in Pittsfield. Was it on North Street? That reminds me of when we lived on the farm. It must be 80 years ago. We went to a one-room schoolhouse. Didn't you drive past it once? Each row was a different grade. I sat in the first seat of the first row. The teacher's name was Miss Brown. She was so pretty. I wonder if she's still alive. The day before we left the farm, our cat disappeared. We couldn't find her anywhere. I was sad for weeks. 3 months later, she showed up at our new house in Pittsfield. Robbins Avenue. I can't think of the number now. My sister was in New York. She didn't like the people she was living with, so she'd visit us. She fell in love with the young man who lived next door. Morris, your Uncle Morris. They got married and moved to Cleveland. They're both gone now, aren't they? You know, I can't picture her. A few years later, we moved to New York. This just jumped into my mind. I must have been 3 years old. We were still in Russia, Mir, a small town, but famous for its yeshiva. My oldest brother, Joe, took our horses down to the river. They were the two best horses in the town. My father had a phaeton, a beautiful old buggy. He was like a taxi driver. He took people to Minsk or Vilna. That day he was at the station, passenger station, waiting for customers. My brother was still just a kid. He must have been washing the horses in the river. I can remember. It was a hot day. Maybe he was giving them a drink. And while I was watching, the reins got caught around a pole in the river. The horses kept twisting the reins around that pole. It was slippery. The reins kept sliding down under the water, and they were pulling the horses down with them. I ran into town and got my father, who came running back with a knife in his teeth. He jumped into the river with all his clothes on. He took the knife and sawed away at the reins until he finally cut through. He saved the horses. I haven't thought about this in 1,000 years. It's like a dream. You get up, it's forgotten. Then it all comes back. Didn't I ever tell you? Look at me. I'm starting to cry. What's there to cry about? Such an old, old memory. Why should it make me cry?
Lloyd, that's
Thank you.
just beautiful. And I
Oh,
feel like I've gotten to know your mother a little bit through that. I mean,
oh, good.
what a special thing. Well, so tell us more about this poem, because I have to tell you, I especially loved when you told me that your mother kind of lived in this special space between being Russian and traditional and American, and how I guess your cousins would go to her for advice because she sort of understood the American way. So tell us more about
Right.
her.
Yeah. Well, she was the youngest of 5 children. Um, her that in that family picture, that group picture, which was probably taken in the 20s, she is the she's in the last row and she's the middle person. And I think you can already see that she is more stylish. Um, of course, she's younger than her relatives. Um, um, she's standing in front of her parents. Uh, so she came over from Russia when she was very, very young, and my grandparents were living on a farm outside of Pittsfield. He was he had to do with horses. He was actually a harness maker, and he was a harness maker for the English army in South Africa during the Boer War. I think the wrong side when we look back on it now. But maybe someone else in his family came to America and were farmers in the Berkshires outside of Pittsfield. And so my mother was really the first, and I would say maybe only person in her immediate family to Americanize. So she went to, she started first grade. And she sat in the first row of the, the first seat in the first row of her little, one-room schoolhouse classroom. And she really, you wouldn't know if you spoke to her that she was not born in America. She had no accent. Um, no European accent, but she was totally bilingual. She could write in both Yiddish and English. Um, she had to leave school probably in junior high. It's a picture of her that I that that I that I love. Um, she had to quit school and get a job because she was the person who was left to take care of her parents. And then her father died, so she was taking care of her mother. She was close to 40 when she finally got married. But she had as far as I know, she really was the first woman in Brooklyn to drive a car because she worked for an auto repair shop in the Bronx across the street from Yankee Stadium. And the people there gave her a car and she learned how to drive it. And she would drive back and forth from Williamsburg to Yankee Stadium. Um, she was someone who was, I'm sure we had the first, I mean, this is before I was born. I'm sure she had the first telephone on the block, probably the first radio. She had a record player, an old Victrola, and she had a record collection, and she loved Broadway shows and popular, the popular music of the time. And I think, but she spoke Yiddish at home because her mother didn't know any English at all. And even my father, who was from Romania, and could speak English with heavily accented English. He could speak English and he could read and write Yiddish, but he didn't read and write English. And as you said before, my younger cousins, who were of course all older than I was, but when they were teenagers, their parents, quote unquote, didn't understand them, and they went to my mother, and my mother was the person that they could really talk to. And my cousins adored her, because she really was she was a kind of surrogate mother to all of them. I think if she had been able to stay in school, I think she would have become a teacher, and that she would have been a great teacher as a job. She was a great teacher as a human being.
That's beautiful. And I just love, in all of our talking, how many different impacts she's had on you. So let's move forward in time a little bit with the poem that's actually the sequel to what we heard last, to the Two Horses. You have another piece that's called He Tells His Mother What He's Working On. And I think what I love is this takes us from the place of your mother's voice to your voice, but in the same relationship. So would you share it?
I would love to. Thank you. He tells his mother what he's working on. I'm writing a poem about you. You are? What's it about? It's the story about your childhood, the horses in the river. The ones that nearly drowned, I saved them. You told it to me just a few weeks ago. I should dig up more of my memories. I wish you would. Like when I lived on the farm and one of the girls fell down the well? Yes. I forget if it was Rose or Pauline. It was a deep well. I remember that story. Have you finished your poem? I'm still working on it. You mean you're correcting it with commas and semicolons? Exactly. When can I see it? As soon as it's finished. Is it an epic? It's not that long. No, I mean all my thoughts, the flashes of what's going through my life, the whole family history, living through the woe, the river and the water. I know. Will it be published? I have to finish it first. It's better to write about real life. That's more important than writing something fanciful. I try to write all my poems about real life. You see, the apple never falls far from the tree. I guess not. You're my apple. There's probably a worm crawling through that apple. Then it's got something sweet to chew on. Well, you're my tree. Yes, I'm your tree. You're an apple. I'm a tree.
Lloyd, I could listen to you all day. But
Don't
to
tempt
wrap
me.
my head around what we want to talk about next, because I'm just so engrossed. here's what I find interesting. You mentioned to me that you're an only child, which I think comes through very clearly in this poem with the apple and the tree. And it's clear that you really were the centerpiece of your mother's life. And I know that impacted your trajectory and to become a poet. So tell us more about how did she inspire you? How did your upbringing inspire you to become a poet?
Well, very indirectly. Um, I mean, I have a dim memory. I mean, my mother taught me English, taught me Yiddish. In fact, Yiddish, as you said before, was my first language because that's what we spoke at home. But my mother read to me in English, and she had books, and she had an anthology of great literature, and she would read me poems, and they didn't exactly I didn't exactly understand them, but there was something beautiful about the language. And she would sing, and taught me popular songs, and but popular songs of the 40s, say, and Cole Porter and Gershwin and Rodgers and Hart and Rodgers and Hammerstein, and I would learn the words and I would learn the songs. But also, but again, very indirectly, I had really no ambitions to become a writer. Um, I wanted to be an actor. I wanted to be an architect, and it never occurred to me even that I would be an English major. But I sort of I did better in English than in math when I was in high school, and when I was a senior in high school, I had an English teacher who was really the man named he was Mr. Canfer, was my English teacher, who was someone who would do anything to get his students interested in poetry, especially in poetry. And that's where I really learned poetry. And I can still picture Alan Canfer jumping on top of his desk and holding out his hand, reciting, "Is this a dagger that I see before me?" from Macbeth. And no teacher I ever had would ever do anything so dramatic. And I fell in love with poetry, and I thought, I I have to write poetry too. But I couldn't write like any of the, Shakespeare or Keats or Robert Frost or Emily Dickinson, whom we read in the class. I had to find my own way of writing. And that took a very long time. That took a very long time. Um, and I started writing in the voices of other people, real and imaginary. And my mother became one of my subjects. And when she was in her late 80s, she lived to be about 100. We don't know exactly because all the papers are, somewhere or nowhere. Um, and she would say things that were just remarkable, like the story of the two horses. And I thought, I really have to write this down. I mustn't forget what she was telling me. Um, there's another poem. I mean, since this is really about sort of Jewish background, there's a poem called "She Forgets," which is really the first poem that I started writing about her in those stages where she was suffering so much. That she was the person who taught me about the Holocaust, and taught me music. And this was something that was very important to her, that I be aware of, that as I was growing up, I needed to know about that. And she was very articulate and moving about the Holocaust, about what happened.
That must have been really hard for you, for her, but a really kind of incredible experience for you.
Yeah, and you know, I mean, this was probably, yeah, it was, had to still be during, this is how old I am. It was during World War II, and my cousins were fighting, were in Europe and Asia. Uh,
Um,
and they all survived, but not always in great health. I mean, they were wounded, and this was very important for me, for my mother, for me to understand what, you know, kind of history of the family and of the world, and what it meant to be, Jewish. She was, you know, my both of my parents, my whole family were Orthodox, with the one exception of chicken chow mein on Saturday afternoons.
I can relate because my New York Jewish family would do the same.
As far as she was concerned, chicken chow mein was kosher.
Totally kosher. I
Yeah,
love it.
right.
Okay, so Lloyd, I promised people 20 minutes and we're just about out of time, but you have one
Oh,
more poem prepared that I really want to make space to read right now. So you've talked all about your mother and that side of the family. From what I understand, you have a very different relationship with your father's side of the family. And so I would love it if you would read this poem about your father's side. And it's called
yeah,
My Other
my
Grandmother.
other grandmother. Um, my other grandmother. Her pale, square face looks out like fate through a dark kerchief clipped under her chin with a narrow, elegant pin. You can make out a white headband under her shawl. Her jacket and skirt cut from the same coarse, dark cloth. The uneven stitches of her hem, hand sewn, dark leather men's shoes sticking out. Yet her face has no coarseness. High cheekbones, high forehead, small nose. Her narrow, suspicious eyes don't give much away. The corners of her mouth turn down almost in a sneer, her private mind at work. The closer you look, the younger she seems. 40, dressed up to look 60. She could be an actress in a peasant costume, except for the rough cloth of her thick hands, her long, thick fingers in her lap, curling under her long thumb. Her hips seem broad, but maybe the thick cloth makes her look heavy. Her sons and daughters, one greedy, one resigned to poverty and loose teeth, one fat and jolly, one angry with the world, unfatherly, unmotherly, yet he could still charm the ladies. Was it from her they inherited their bitterness, their charm, their nerve? Her only trace, this worn photo, crudely cut out and pasted to a piece of cardboard. My father must have carried it with him. Did he ever hear a word from her? Could she write? Or about her after he left home, left Europe? Did he know when she had died? Her name was Leah. He never spoke of her.
Wow. That's really powerful. And even though it's the personal voice, a very, very different kind of poem than the others. Tell us a little bit more about it.
Yeah. Well, I found this photograph among my in a pile of photographs. Mostly, we never had any photographs from my father's side of the family. My father was the bitter son of that mother. Um, uh, and I was haunted by that photograph. So strange. Must have been taken in Romania because they lived in Iași. My father's parents, but I was on such bad terms with my father that it never even occurred to me to ask about his background, about his family. Only things indirectly that I heard, that maybe he escaped Romania to avoid being drafted when he was a teenager. Uh, I know he lived in Paris. He might have been a stowaway when he came to America, because we found some sort of little official form that had a name on it that no one recognized among his belongings.
Interesting.
And he worked in a sweatshop until he retired. And he did mellow after he quit work. He hated work. He called the owners of the sweatshop the Hitler brothers. And, you know, and that, so, but that photo really is my only clue to my father's side of the family. I mean, I knew my aunts and uncles, and they were all so different from one another. My aunt in Cleveland, who was the fat and jolly one, was so loving and tender, and my other aunt was not very nice to me, and accused me of stealing the marbles that the kid next door had given me. This was a dysfunctional family in many ways. I see occasionally some of my father's traits in me, and that really scares me.
I was going to say, Lloyd, for such a kind and mild-mannered guy who writes such beautiful poetry, it's hard to imagine, but I find it incredible how you reconstruct this family history through this work.
Yeah, well, it's true. I mean, it was not an intent. It wasn't my intention, but it really has sort of come out that way.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating for me to even to talk about and think about.
And I just have to say, I'm not the only one who says thank you for giving us this beautiful tribute to your mother and to your family, because it's all over the chat. So yes, so I just want to say that I think the work you're doing is not only beautiful, but I'm really taken by the tribute and the history and what you're able to tell through these pieces. So while we are at time, I would love to hear more stories another day, because this is really just really, really beautiful and meaningful. So thank you. I will also make a plug that even though we didn't have time to read the poem that is the name of your book, Little Kisses, that you referenced when your mom started to lose her memory, and how that poem in that book is about that time. And I highly recommend that people check that out. It's called Little Kisses, and we can send it out in an email after, because I think that's just really moving. So
thank you
Lloyd,
so much, Laura.
This has been so wonderful. Thank you for telling us so much that is so personal.
Well, thank you, Laura, and you're a very easy person to talk to, and nice person to talk to. It was I was very moved by your questions and your comments. Thank you
Well,
so much.
thank you for your honesty, for the beauty of your work, for being with us. This really means a lot because this is why we do this JLive series, so that we can hear stories like yours. So thank you for being a part of this with us. Of course, for everyone out there, as you know, J Arts programming is only made possible by generous community support from people like you. So if you feel inspired, please help or make a gift today to help continue the JLive series and more. And Lloyd, to be continued. This has been so wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you so much. Very, very grateful.
Talk to you soon. Have a great one,
You.
everyone.
Happy New Year too.
Yeah, you too.